Okay. Evening, guys.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I wonder who would monitor. Usually, when you put a phone on, also, I think the sound may reflect in this. But if you would have a silent way of monitoring Facebook, if people come on or ask questions or something.
It's on the Maritime Initiative Africa thing, right?
Yes. Right, I'd like to welcome all of you, colleagues, and those who are joining us on this live show for the first time, or if you've ever been with us, you're welcome. Today, we're going with a new formula. We're going to have just a little bit of the news item. Thereafter, there'll be a presentation which we would discuss after, and if you have questions, you can send them to us as well through the Facebook chat or message platform or YouTube as well, and we can respond to them. Or if you have a suggestion also, you can also put it there. So we would start with Jeffrey. Jeffrey would give us a curated news from Docklines, which he puts together under the auspices of Marseille Freak, and thereafter the presentation will be done by myself. So over to you, Jeffrey.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening to you, and good evening to your wonderful listeners. This is the May Maritime News segment, where we select some of top news and articles in May to create awareness and also to promote the maritime industry. This segment, as you already said, is brought to you by courtesy of Docklines. Now, for the first article, it says women are a mainstay of fishing in West Africa, but they get a raw deal. This article highlighted on artisanal fishing, which is said to be a crucial source of livelihood for 80% of fish consumed and supports livelihood of about 24 million people. It also spoke about the fact that men dominate fishing and production, while women dominate just the post-harvesting processing, that is, dressing, sorting, and also the marketing and selling. Now, the contributions of women are underpaid, undervalued, and largely invisible. They do not earn enough and have restricted rules. They have no buying power to purchase fish to earn a living for a long period, and no access to required processing and storage facilities to avoid fish loss. He also spoke about the fact that there was gender bias at institutional level, also at policy making, and also in the giving of capital grants. The second one was on the fact that the ship owner had unfettered right to collect freight under the BL, even whilst on time charter. Now, this introduced an interesting dynamic, and it made things clearer in the chartering market, in the sense that back then there was the wild held perception that the ship owner cannot interfere with freight collection, but only with her. They can only interfere with freight collection only when the charterer defaults in giving out hire. But this made it clearer. It said that under the owner's bill of lading, the ship owner can actually get access to the freight and would only have to make account to the charterer. The third one was on the Egypt's president approving the Suez Canal widening plan. As you all know, 10% of world trade plies that route. In 2015, Egypt opened a second lane to the Suez and increased capacity from 50 to 97. Although they invested about 8 billion, there's a projected 13.2 billion to be made annually by 2023. So then this also shows that this investment will not be in vain. But then there are other questions we should be asking, because Japan also seems to be talking about alternatives. Russia is also trying to introduce the Siberian Transport Railway. And also, with regard to the Silk and Belt Initiative, there are other questions to be asked with regards to alternatives and whether the Suez Canal would actually be much more profitable. Now, the fourth one is about the Maritime Academy in saving about 1.8 billion naira in 1 year. The director said that he has been able to save 1.8 billion naira by blocking wastages and reckless disbursements within a year. He has just about 5 months to complete his tenure, but he believes he surpassed what he set out to achieve through prudent management, prevention of fraud acts, and blocking wastage. He said the school is surviving even though they have not yet received their 2021 grants from NIMASA. There is no money from outside conventional sources, and there has been improved living condition of cadets and enhanced working environment. He also said that some staff involved in corrupt practices, siphoning money through their own companies, were eventually found out and blacklisted. The fifth one is about pirate attack on a Ghanaian vessel. A Ghanaian registered vessel attacked by 5 pirates within Ghanaian territorial waters. That's on May 19 at 7 p.m. The vessel's course was altered and 5 experts crew members were kidnapped. The captain, the chief officer, the second officer, chief engineer, and Botchway. Now, the pirates spent about 6 hours on board. There were no injuries, but belongings were taken. Neighbors were alerted to help intercept the pirate skiff and boat, but unfortunately, that couldn't happen. Then also, the shipping leaders disagree the future of LNG in shipping. Now, there's been a contentious debate over the use of LNG as the decarbonization option for the sector. Now, most people are greenwashing, say that although it's a fossil fuel that can eradicate sulfur, nitrogen, black carbon emissions, and also reduce carbon dioxide emissions, it also carries the risk of unburned methane escaping. That's the methane slip. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is 36 times more warming than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. And the World Bank suggests that government should not support LNG on environmental and economic grounds. Over to you, Jonas.
Thank you very much, Jeff. These news items are quite interesting, but we decided to move away from it because we intend to... Thank you very much, Jeff. Sorry. So these news items are quite interesting. They raise a lot of issues that we can discuss, but we've decided to zoom into critical issues, some of which may fall within those items. But you can always refer back to the Docklines magazine and then read the details. In the next few months or months ahead, we have decided to discuss in detail topical issues in the industry. And so we have taken cognizance of the fact that there are several people who have done important research in the industry with very good findings, which usually we keep on the shelves or in some repository online. But it is important that we share this with the public, and we'll try as much as possible not to be too theoretical about these things, but share them in a manner that is applicable and makes people understand as well. And whilst we do this, we also educate ourselves and build capacity alongside. And so we're going to start today with a topic that is probably gaining currency on the African continent. And I'll start the presentation today. In the next few weeks, we'll have other researchers from Ghana and Ghanaians or African researchers around the continent and probably around the world as well to share their findings with us. And as usual, we will have this panel as discussants, Dr. vanDyck, Dr. AJ Sagoe, and Jeffrey. And for you out there listening to us, you can always join the discussion by sending us a message on Facebook or on the YouTube channel of the African Transportation Convos or the Maritime Initiative Facebook page. And we'll be happy to listen to you and answer your questions or have your suggestions as well. If you would want to join in on the video for subsequent ones, you can make a request and then we can accede to that as well. Okay. So without wasting much time, today we'll go into the topic that we have for you today. I hope it's quite clear. Is it visible to everyone? Is it visible, guys?
Yes, it's visible.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Perfect. So, I'd like to look at integrating Africa into global shipping networks. If we say global shipping networks, we're looking at the major lanes of shipping. Usually we talk about direct services of shipping lines that brings countries or regions into the world global logistics and supply chain. And usually this is achieved by various means, and that is what we are going to look at. Africa has always been seen to be on the periphery of these global shipping networks, and so we do not take advantage of some of the developments in modern shipping that brings down the costs of trade, and so we would look deep into this and see where we fall short. And some of this is coming from research that I am doing with some of my colleagues on the port of Tema, and also looking at some parts of Africa as well, with extensive literature review on the continent. And when I go through this, I would also give some recommendations as well, which we can discuss after. So I start with these quotes from the Chief Executive Officer of the Meridian Port Services. Meridian Port Services is a container terminal operator in Ghana, specifically in the port of Tema in Ghana. And they have recently, in 2019, opened a terminal that is called Terminal 3 at the port of Tema. And this terminal, as we usually say, is a modern terminal, sophisticated, with all the modern equipment and facilities that you require of a container port terminal facility. Now, he says that the MPS Terminal 3 of Tema Port was created to facilitate trade by creating newer routes and establish West Africa's best equipped transshipment hub. This monumental action is a step in the right direction to realizing the potential of this great infrastructure. With this, Africa is becoming more integrated into the global shipping network. So this is what Samara says. And we would see whether this is really what is happening or not. There was research by Fraser, Notteboom, and the crew in Southern Africa around 2016 regarding this same issue of integration into global shipping networks. And the expectation was that Southern Africa, where we have some good ports, including Durban, would be part of this so-called global shipping network. But unfortunately, the hypothesis that they put forward, they refuted it because it wasn't the case that the region, not a particular port, was becoming integrated. And there were certain reasons why this was not so. And as we go along, you'd see these same reasons probably pop up here as well, and I would explain. So, based on Samara's statement that Tema, and for that matter, Africa is becoming more integrated into the global shipping network, it's not just based on wishful thinking. Indeed, there's been great development in West Africa, let's say, because we don't have all the facts about the other regions. But we've seen a serious competition for what we call the hub status in West Africa, and it's also happening in the eastern part of Africa as well, where ports are competing to be known as the hub ports in that region, the preferred ports for the major shipping lines to call first or directly. And so there's construction of new terminals all along the coast of West Africa. And this competition is quite tense, even though it involves the same group of people or the same operators. Now, because of these new terminals that are coming up, considering their size and their ability to handle modern and larger ships, we are seeing an improvement in what we call the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index. It takes two important indexes to determine whether we are doing well in the maritime sector, and this is one of them. The Liner Shipping Connectivity Index was designed by UNCTAD to determine whether you actually are connected to this so-called global shipping network. Now, through the lens of these port terminals on the continent, we can decipher if we are gradually fitting into that global shipping network or not. And there are several factors that determine your position on this index. Africa had always been quite low there. The best performing ports had always been the ports in North Africa, particularly Tanger Med and Port Said on the Mediterranean, because as you know, the Mediterranean ports get to see a lot of vessels coming through their ports, because a lot of vessels use the Suez Canal and they go through the Mediterranean. So Port Said and Tanger Med are very important ports who have always performed above all the African ports until recently. I mean, they're still at the top, but now they have some other ports joining them, and we'll see that shortly. Now, the indicators are here, the components. So your position on this index is determined by the number of shipping companies that provide shipping services, and then also the number of services that are on the routes that you are, or that are made from your port or terminal, the number of ships that call per month, the total deployed container carrying capacity. So if you put all the vessels of the shipping lines together, their capacity together, that's what we're talking about here. And that will be also determined by the size of the vessels that are coming in. So the size of the largest vessels that come to the port. And lastly, the number of direct service without the need for transshipment. So if you're getting direct services, then you are seen as an important port. So these are the 6 indicators. Terminals or ports will do well in some of them. You don't have to do well in all of them, but your marks in each of these will determine your position on the index. And this is what we've seen recently. You can see a story developing here, especially if you look at Lome and Tema. So, like I said before, Tanger Med and Port Said on the Mediterranean, they've always seen good results because they get a lot of vessels coming through the Suez Canal and going to these ports. And then you look at Durban. Durban is in South Africa. And South Africa, is much more developed than most sub-Saharan African countries. It's one of the BRICS countries, those countries that we refer to as the transitioning countries, moving fast towards first world status. So it has a lot of traffic. There's a lot of trade going between South Africa and other countries. So the connectivity is higher than most African countries. But recently we've seen these 2 ports in West Africa climbing so quickly. I mean, Togo, we probably at first hand or by first evidence say, well, because MSC built their home ports over there. And so they started climbing up because MSC was sending big vessels there. Then you look at Tema, 2019, third quarter, between second and third quarter, when the MPS terminal was opened, they climbed up sharply. And then not too long, they overtook Togo as well. So you can see what the indicators can do. Because if you look at MPS, in the last couple of years, this terminal is 16 meters deep. So they had never seen vessels as large as the ones you see in the picture over here until this last couple of years. Terminal was receiving vessels in the range of 5,000 TEUs and so on. But now we are seeing vessels as large as 15,000 TEUs coming to these ports. So the vessel sizes are increasing. The capacity of the vessels deployed by the shipping lines is increasing. There are couple of reasons for this as well. I mean, these vessels that used to be the big vessels decades ago in Europe, and we were not seeing them along the West African coast, are now probably the mid-sized vessels, the 8,000 TEUs, the 15,000 TEUs, and they're being shifted quickly to these new ports that are developing in Africa or in West Africa, if I should say. And the 20,000s and others are still doing the Asia-Europe, Asia-American routes. So they definitely have to find a way to use these vessels when the big vessels come in. And if you're a port that is not prepared, then you will lose out. And probably that is what is happening with these new ports. Once you give them the ability, if you have the capability, the depth, and the ability to handle them, then you would have the shipping lines bringing them in. But it also depends on your potential for the trade in your country or in the region. And you can see direct services also coming in. So if you read, you go to the Meridian Port Services website, you can see the chronology of how things have happened over the years and the vessels that they've received since the terminal was opened. And you'd see a constant arrival of vessels around 13,000 TEU, 15,000 TEUs coming through that port, and shipping lines declaring new services on these routes as well. And that is probably what accounts for this sharp increase up here. Now, this is not only happening in Ghana and in Togo. All the others would probably come up once their terminals come online. But should we say that because of this, we are already in that global shipping network, or we are approaching it? There's another indicator that we need to look at as well. So this is the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index. There's also what we call the Logistics Performance Index, and that is where our biggest problem is. And that's why I call this slide Obstacle to Competitiveness. In the literature that many of researchers have done, you would see that there's this gradual, apparent distinction between technical efficiency and operational efficiency. And the technical one has always got to do with the first part that we've talked about, the improvements on the seafront, the new terminals that have come in, the modern equipment, the handling capacities, the depth of the basins, and so on and so forth. So there, and the terminal operating systems and all that has brought significant improvement or efficiency that is compared to what is happening around the world. So it's world-class facilities, and the operations there are also world-class. But what is referred to as operational efficiency usually refers to activities after the goods have been landed in the ports and have been moved from the port or are about to be moved from the port. So all the issues that have to do with infrastructure, customs, ease of arranging shipments, logistics, service quality, international shipments, tracking and tracing, timeliness. This is where the real issue of most African terminals or ports are. The seafront is now performing well because of the presence of these global terminal operators who are bringing in good technology, good management practices, and so on and so forth. But this is where our real issues lie. When the goods have been landed and they have to go into the hinterlands to go to the consignees or or the shippers in general, then there's an issue. Infrastructure, road infrastructure, plus other infrastructure that is needed to cut these things to the end user is a problem. Customs clearance has always taken days and months in some countries. And that is where the real costs builds up after there's been an efficiency in shipments at the sea leg and also at the discharge point. Then there's the ease of arranging shipments, and this has to do with a lot of the service providers in the logistics chain. And then international shipments. This has to do also with services and the connectivity to partners abroad, how we arrange shipments. And in this case, understanding of things like Incoterms. Which shipping terms do you use when you are shipping goods from one point to the other? If you make a mistake, there's going to be a lot of delays and there'll be misunderstanding, which will result in increased costs and time delays. And this would always amount to some monetary or disputes, basically. There's track and tracing, which has to do with technology as well, and that has its roots also in infrastructure. If you don't have good internet services, you don't have companies giving you visibility of your cargo that is going through the chain, then that's also an issue for a lot of progressive companies, and timeliness as well. So this is the part that we have a real problem with. And so we don't have a complete quality service that is being offered from the ports that we have. Now, there's a conundrum that we need to tackle, basically, and that has to do with port governance. African ports have been invaded, should I say invaded, with these global terminal operators. When I say global terminal operators, I'm talking about companies that, stevedoring companies that have internationalized their services. And so they have footprints in various countries and they operate in a network. And these global operators are very powerful. In 2009, they controlled about 64% of all containers that were handled in the world. 64%, really high. And this is up from about 46 in 2001. I'm not sure what it is now, because those who do this analysis highly guard their data. Unless you buy it, you don't get it. But this is the latest I've found. So as late as 2009, they're at 64%. I don't know what it is now, because some of them are even consolidating. So their powers might even be increasing. But that is how big these companies are. They started as just stevedoring companies who went into international markets, and with the currency of privatization or private involvement in ports in several regions of the world, there was an advantage they saw, and others joined, and now we have even shipping lines joining this fray as well. They have a lot of advantages, which is hard for local competitors to beat. Quite a lot of advantages, and we find it hard to. Let me just go through these notes and give you some indications. They possess some competencies that local firms or incumbent port operators don't have, and so gradually they are taking over a lot of terminals around the world. And these are the capabilities that they have. They have scale and scope, economies of scale and scope. They have huge market power and marketing skills, and technological expertise as well, and easy access to cheap sources of finance. If you're a local company, you can't compete with this kind of power. Mind you, when port authorities want to give their terminals to private people to operate, they require a certain minimum performance level. In most concession agreements, you would also find that they want you to be able to bring in a certain amount of throughput also, which means that the marketing is important. Access to a network is very important as well. So if you don't have that kind of network, then it becomes very difficult. And because these companies are huge and have the financial muscles, they have these central purchasing departments in their headquarters who can arrange large contracts with suppliers of terminal equipment, terminal operating systems, softwares. Sometimes they even develop those softwares in-house, and they are proprietary softwares. They have big research and development units around the world. And this whole network is what enables them to be able to offer services at a certain cost. So if you are a small local company, it's hard to compete with such muscle. And that's why even though African ports want to kind of limit their ports to, have a control of their ports. And that's why I put nationalism here. It looks like they are not prepared to let it go because they feel, well, these guys come in and they make so much money. And they look at the money and say, well, we can also operate it ourselves and make the same money. But it's not easy to do that. Another reason is the fact that, well, ports in our countries, African countries, are seen as a means to provide employment for the people. And when you bring in private people, then they restrict how many people can be employed. And that kind of affects the political fortunes of the politicians. And so they don't really want it to go totally. It's you don't have to lose when you do a concession agreement. If you have the capacity, you can always arrange something good that you can also benefit from, but it's always monetary. Employment would always be an issue, which you also have to look at because it's a developing country. Now, because of this, African ports are caught in between this conundrum. So somehow they, instead of going full landlord or whatever, most of them are calling themselves hybrid ports, trying to take advantage of the advantages of all the other port management systems. And by and by in the media, when issues about private involvement in ports come up, there's a certain kind of misunderstanding, and we saw that in Ghana's case when MPS, or Meridian Port Services, started operating at a thermal port, where people think that part of the port has been sold to a foreign private operator. And so some would say, well, so I've seen comments even in social media where people say, so Ghana only owns 30% of thermal ports. And you raise an eyebrow when people say those kinds of things.
Excuse me, Mr. Aryee, I think your screen has gone dark.
It's gone dark.
It's gone dark on Facebook and YouTube. So if you could reshare, we'll probably stop the presentation and reshare the screen again. I think that should solve it.
Okay. Got it again. Showing now? Still? Is it showing?
Yes, it's back. Please carry on.
Showing now. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. So on this misunderstanding of the private issue, it's not a privatization of the ports. There's hardly any private ports around the world, except probably in the UK. But it's a concession agreement. It's a lease, and to avoid these conflicts, I think there are several things that we need to consider in that. Now, if you look at the global terminal operators in West Africa, for instance, it's only limited to APMT and Bolloré Logistics. In other parts of Africa, I think there's DP World, I think in Senegal and Djibouti. George, correct me if I'm wrong. And Yeah.
We do have DP World in Dakar, and then we have DP World we had DP World in Djibouti.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. So they are gradually entering the fray in Africa as well. And these are business people, so they are in for the profits, and so they don't just come in for coming's sake. They do their serious analysis of the port and the market in which they are entering. And probably there are not too many on the continent, and APM and Bolaria all over the place, because it's hard to have 2 or 3 of them in the same port as you see in Europe, because the volumes of the trade are not very high. And so if 2 or 3 compete in some of these ports, then none of them would actually gain much from this. But I think that as the trade increases, you would see much more of them coming in as well. Almost ending. So looking at all of this, I have pinpointed 4 factors that I think would help increase the competitiveness of ports on the African continent. So first, I believe that there needs to be a clear port policy for most of the ports in Africa. It looks like they're dangling in the middle, not knowing, well, even though there are private involvement in their ports, they don't put out a clear policy where an investor can actually pick and look at and say, well, I would want to go into this or join this free or not. It often happens that, well, people come out and try to negotiate, and sometimes it falls through, sometimes it happens. And there are issues with some of these contracts, especially when political power is changing from one hand to the other. And so a clear policy is needed. Secondly, I believe African ports need to build capacity in negotiating the concession agreements to get a fair deal. I mean, you can't be a landlord and negotiate a deal that puts you at in a position where you gain nothing. It's I don't know who do that. So we really need to build capacity in negotiating these agreements, and probably limit the political influence on these as well. The third one that I've been thinking about has to do with the stakeholders' operational efficiency. That's when it comes to the other border agencies. So this is really not in the hands of the Port Authority. These are other state agencies that have full legal rights to be at the port to perform their duties as well. And when we look at the Logistics Performance Index, one of the components has to do with these institutions who often become a bottleneck in the supply chain. And many research projects have attested to this. And it's a difficult one to solve because most of the time it involves the human beings. And human beings are very complicated, and it's hard to solve anything that involves humans. And lastly, the biggest fear of government have always been the employment issue. That's why they never want the ports to go. Ports are national assets everywhere. So usually when I hear people say it's national asset, it has to be in the hands of, it's always in the hands of the states, because the Ports Authority represents the states. Terminal operators are only there to provide a service. And so we must find a way to expand this industry. We usually either collapse industries or shrink them, or they just remain as they are, and we put more people in without expanding the resources that will be used to cater for the people. And I've been saying this for a long time, that the state agencies involved in this industry must develop the industry and the allied industries so that people would have employment in other places apart from just filling the ports up with people and consuming the little revenue that they make there as well. So these are my own suggestions considering what we've gone through. So to recap, we're looking at Africa joining ports moving into the global shipping network. And we've seen that on one side, we have world-class facilities that are, yes, helping us to fall in line or join this global shipping network. But on the other hand, there are other things that are impeding that fast improvement that is happening on the seaside or at the waterfront, and which needs to be looked at gradually. I believe even in the LPI, we've made some improvement, but there's more room for improvements because a lot of countries have resorted to technology, but there's another discussion to be had with the introduction of technology and how it has helped or has not helped in solving these issues. But the larger one is also infrastructure, which cuts across the continent. And so maybe in the months ahead, we would have people to talk about these issues as well. And I've gone through what I think can be done to help solve these issues as well. So I think it will be time to have a discussion on it. Thank you very much for listening. If you have questions, you can put them in the message box, and then we'll try to address them as well. Guys, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Thank you very much. That was a good presentation. My question, however, has got to do with the media engagement. You spoke about media and misunderstanding. I don't know, but what can we do to improve media engagement within the maritime space and also encourage them to actually promote and provoke certain discussions within the maritime space, especially with regards to port management?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some parts of the continent, the media is quite strong. If you talk of Nigeria, South Africa, I think they are quite matured in the understanding of what happens in the maritime sector. A lot of the times we have, or they have, if you read a lot of the articles that are put out there, it's usually pinpointing the problems that are. There's there's a bit of a difficulty in assessing data also with maritime institutions. And so what they usually put out would be the things that, everybody sees, or if they have an informant in, they would give them information. But we really hardly have hard data for them to use. In other parts of Africa, it's people don't understand the industry as much. I was in Kenya once, and they had it was a conference when they had this Blue Economy big conference in Kenya. I was there, and a lady from the Port Authority, one of the managers there, and I think she was a member of ICS as well, Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers, and she really lamented on the need to develop capacity in Kenya. She made mention of the fact that even employment into the ports was first based on your passing of the ICS test, but they couldn't. Most of the people were not passing, so they scrapped that requirement. So to think that even people or managers in the ports are not getting that education, how much more people in the media? So there's a huge gap there, and we see that in Ghana as well. It depends also on the willingness of the media to learn or to find out for themselves what's happening in these areas. In the Regional Maritime University, we've had a couple of media engagements, and most of the people who had come are Nigerians who would organize themselves and come all the way to Ghana to have this education. But if you ask the media in Ghana to come for something like that, they would rather ask you to give them money to come. The Nigerians pay their way here, they find accommodation and still pay for participation. But we've tried a few times to get Ghanaian media, and maybe you yourself probably have organized something like that or tried to organize something like that before. You know the experience. They rather come and they need the resources from you. And maybe it's also from their management or their media houses who are not willing to support that. But I think that it would grow because now maritime issues have become, it's not conservative like we knew it before. From my experience, I've seen that now people are really concerned about that industry, also because politicians are interested, and so it's become very important to them. And maybe sometime later I'll do another presentation on how media articles on this industry have astronomically increased about a decade ago. In the 1990s, you hardly hear anything about even the Tema ports or the Tema that you stay. You hardly hear anything. If you hear anything, it's in relation to export of cocoa or something. But from 2000, it's crazy how much has been written on the ports. But most of the time, it's from political angles and all that. So we would look at that later. George, Alberta?
Okay. Sorry, just to announce that Alberta had an emergency and had to leave. But I do want to expand the discussion a bit. Jonas has particularly talked about basically the ports integration into global shipping networks. And I want to expand the discussion. Basically the same thing, but looking at it on a more wider scope. And in these modern times, this is how ports actually should be thinking. Not necessarily integrating to shipping networks, but integrating into global supply chains. Right. And by default, would integrate into shipping networks. And I think for African ports, that is the way we have to think, because when we start thinking that way, then it affects the way we do our things. Now, a lot of studies have been undertaken, especially with Notteboom, Van Islander, and a few other, Langen, and a few other authors, De Carbone and the rest, on port terminal supply chain integration. And I'm currently undertaking a study on something similar for West Africa. And you find that there are basically about 5 things that terminals or ports are looking at. They're looking at value-added services that are being offered by the port and, in some instances, the port community. They're looking at information and communication technology that obviously enables more transparency and communication between the port and its internal partners, its external partners. Also, they're looking at sort of an integration between different actors within the port in terms of services. And then you're also looking at your transport infrastructure integration. So basically, you're looking at the seaside where ships are coming in and how integrated the seaside is with the port itself. And the port being that focal node, also being integrated with, could be an inland transport system or some form of land transport system. Could be road, it could be also is the port with other transport infrastructure. And then lastly, you can also talk about some form of inter-organizational integration. And this is the integration between different partners within the port context. And I'm happy you talked about, in terms of increasing competitiveness for African ports, you talked about external actors in the port that the port doesn't have direct control over. This has to do with, for example, customs officials that have to do, or parastatal organizations that have to do some sort of inspection or something to do with cargo that is either coming to the port or leaving the port. So how integrated is the port with these form of organizations that the port doesn't necessarily have control over the operations? And we've seen time and time again that these organizations are the main actors that can actually determine how competitive your port is, how efficient it is, and how competitive the port is. I also wanted to comment on your on increasing the competition of the different suggestions you gave. You talked about the port policy, which I think you hit the nail on the head. It's important that every port has a clear port policy. And it starts by you determining what the role of the port is in the economy, first of all. And I know that's a very large question. I know Jonas has attempted to answer this question in the previous study, and it kept on getting larger and larger and larger. But yes, to start off, you have to know what the role of the port is in the economy. What role is the port playing in your economy? If you can answer that question, then you would know further on how to develop your policy. If for example, if your port is an organization that is strategically placed for employment, to provide employment for youth within a locality, municipality, or within a region, then you can think about, how do I develop my port? You talked about the fight between the government nationalistic look of, let's provide employment, let's develop the area, versus the port becoming a more efficient kind of organization that is looking at profit making. And the more efficient you are in port studies, then the more automated you're becoming. And that also affects your employment status. So first thing, we think about the role, and then we think then how to come up with some long-term plan for the port. What is the long-term plan? Countries in Asia have done something like a phase-out plan. It's a 5-year plan. So in the first 5 years of our policy, this is what we want to do. In the next 5 years, this is what we want to do. And these are just targets. Some countries, go way beyond those phase-out plans. I think another thing to consider under your port policy is the role of your investors. If you're looking at private participation, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, when we talk about private participation, we first of all just think about foreign company coming in with money, with expertise. But there can be private participation which is local. And I think for African countries, it's time we start thinking about developing our own homegrown talents. If we don't get our people into the game and to learn the game, then we'll keep on giving off our concessions to foreign companies to run. And they earn most of the benefits. So what is the policy towards foreign participation? What is the policy also towards local participation in our ports?
But
I think that is...
Yeah, but that's a very difficult one. If you look at... And I think it's our participation in this global committee of nations kind of puts us sometimes at a disadvantage, because the international practice which you need to adhere to would probably be tender it, because this is a huge project. You tender it out for people to bid for, and it's always hard for locals to compete with these internationals, unless you are putting caveats of, even for terminal concession, you can have subcontracting like you do in construction and say local contents for a certain kind of activity. And that's the hard part. And the disadvantage, maybe we missed the boat at a point. This should have probably been done a very long time ago, when the big boys were not home yet. And you could have seen an African terminal in another African country developing terminals and so on and so forth. But now that the whole coast of Africa is been taken over by the global terminal operators, it's hard to see anybody, unless they don't want to go to a certain port, like we've seen in Takoradi in Ghana, where it was, offered to some of these operators for a long time and nobody set up camp there. It's because it's not attractive, and yet a local company has taken it up. my fear is that what nobody wants, you take. I mean, just it could. Well, I don't know the details, but from the face of it, and from the statistics we have on Takoradi, I mean, they hardly even do 20,000 TAs a year. So I don't know to put millions of dollars into that, whether the terminal would generate the trade, or you have to consider the trade first. Or the Port Authority would help them in a way. I'm not sure. We've had policies from government before that says, okay, take textiles to Takoradi. Nobody should import or clear textiles from Tamar again. Go through Takoradi so that they can also generate some revenue. It never worked.
That will not work.
It never worked. So I don't know how that is going to happen. Also,
I think the argument about having local investors, you may not necessarily have the knowledge or the technology, but you can form a consortium with a foreign company and then bid. And this has been done. This is done in Tangiamed, for example. Tangiamed, one, you'd see, by all means, one local Moroccan company involved in Tangiamed 1. Tangiamed 2 as well. Another a local Moroccan company was involved. We have to ensure that this is the way you do technology transfer. Form a consortium, come together, build, operate, and then, after the concession is over, you transfer to a local operator who has now gained the knowledge and the technology to be able to perform this. If we don't do that, we will continue to say that we don't have the knowledge, we don't have expertise, and we don't develop anything. So it's very important. This also goes in line with what you're talking about, capacity development. I know you were speaking in line of negotiating deals and so on and so forth, but I think capacity development also applies to this as well.
I think we've probably missed the boat somewhere before. If you look at, if you take the Tema Port as a case study like that, there were just stevedoring companies, right? A lot of them, private stevedoring companies.
Yes.
You can see me.
We can see you.
From the little lights. All right.
Yeah.
I can see you.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I was saying is that there was opportunity for them to form a consortium, like you were saying, to build that capacity. I mean, I've talked to them before on one of my research rounds in the field, and they even complain that they don't have the capacity. They don't understand simple things like the weight of the cargo they are taking and which sling or the capacity of sling they should use. And so to be on the safe side, you double it or triple it so that you don't cause damage to somebody's cargo. So, I mean, simple things like that. And they even made a proposal to the Port Authority that they were going to pay, in addition to their royalties, something extra so that the Port Authority would include their crew in their training programs when they're taking their personnel for training. So you could see that. But there's a governance issue that comes with the situation you find Tema in also with regards to the stevedoring companies. I mean, we have given them quotas, and up to now we are not able to organize them in a way that makes them strong enough to be able to bid for one terminal or even build their own terminal to operate jointly as a consortium. But they've always been individual terminals. There's political influence that doesn't give them any guarantees that they would be at the port for long. So if you look at the list of companies that have been given licenses over the years, they're always politically linked. There are only few who have stayed throughout, but they keep changing them. And if they were in a consortium, it would have been better. I've read research from Notable and others that shows that even in some of these global terminal operators that I've mentioned, some of the terminals don't really belong to them. Some are backed by pension funds. So pension funds acquire maybe the biggest share in the terminal or the terminal, But because they have no expertise in operating, they hand it over to them. Just like you see in the hotel industry. If I have a hotel, I have money to purchase a hotel, I can give it to one of the big boys like Accor or Best Western to operate it or manage it for me in that manner. So the opportunities for local involvement, like you say, in that regard. But for operations, we would need a lot of capacity building and the resources, because I don't think the global terminal operators would back out of some of these areas that they are engaged. They can always manage it for you. You can have other terminals, but maybe not a container one. Even the bulk sector has similar issues as well.
I think as part of the port policy also, this thing about capacity development, it has to take a central role. The government, and I'm saying the government through the port authority, should put in a plan to say that, look, within the next 10 to 20 years, we want to create at least one local, global port operator, at least for the African region, right? And say that to do that, we are going to ensure that there is some sort of consortium whereby the local guy gets put together with another company to operate a terminal for a certain period of time. After which, the government will facilitate, more trading, expansion of facilities, and so on, and then give it to the local guy to run. If you're not purposeful with these things, we are going to keep on making excuses after excuses and keep on saying that we don't have capacity. Right. It has to come right from the top. It has to be a top-down approach, and that is why I think things like this have to go into your policy. It's important. But I did have a question of something I wasn't very clear about. If you could just clarify something on, you mentioned as the final point something about employment within the sector. So if you could expand a bit about what you meant by the employment and it being part of the port policy. Yeah,
you see, I think the major reason why most African ports are sitting on the fringes, undecided as to whether they are landlord or their service or their. I mean, I think in every port there's private involvement somehow in Africa now. I've seen in one of their conferences in the Association of Ports in West and Central Africa. They had a conference in Togo, I think a couple of years ago, where they even discussed the issue of automation or semi-automation. And the interview that I saw with a couple of attendees from some of the ports in the sub-region, it was almost like, well, we will not allow these foreign guys to come in because when they come, they introduce technology, our people wouldn't get employment. Is there any way out of this? You want to be efficient, you want to be the preferred port, and yet what would make you attain that? You are scared of it because it will cause unemployment. And you can see that this is mainly rhetoric from the political angle, because yes, the port is a state institution and it must play that role of ensuring that people get jobs. In many ports in West Africa, the job at a port authority is a prestigious job. Every graduate who wants to work in the ports, who wants to work, would prefer some of these institutions, and the port is one of them. And if employment is the issue that makes them sit on the fence, then that has to be solved. And in my own thinking, I'm saying that some people even say we don't have a maritime industry, a port industry. We only have a port because there's nothing industry about it. An industry is a combination of firms who work in the same, but you only have one thing standing there. Most of them are in the trade. A lot of companies, if you really interview them and say, which category, where do you belong to? They are not really not in the maritime industry. They are trade-related industry. They are in a trade. They'll tell you they're in the trade sector. So what really is in the maritime industry to employ people? What other thing? There are several services, like you mentioned earlier on, that can be provided to ships, to cargo, to other maritime activities that we are not doing. Some of them are even being performed by foreigners now because they know the opportunities, they understand the industry, and they know what services to provide. And a lot of our local people don't know that. Even a common thing like ship chandling now has been taken over by big international firms. So we really need the authorities to be able to expand the industry so that people can look for jobs not just in the port authority, but other places in the port or other services that they can engage in to also make a living, and not just the port authority. Because authorities now have becoming more of a policy making place, a regulator. You need people there to research and develop other things, and not just a lot of operational people who are, in my words, redundant, because you really don't need all of those people at the port. So those were my thinking on that employment thing.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we've exceeded our time now.
Yeah. But just to add a little, anytime we speak about the port and we speak about employment, I get greatly worried. I don't know, I get greatly worried. I've had a short stint at the port, and you realize that anytime there is, let's say, local participation, the work is done in a certain manner. And anytime there's any foreign interference, or maybe let's say foreign participation, the work is also done in an efficient manner. You realize that so long as government pushes for people to enter the port for employment sake, we will not be able to develop it the way we want to develop it. You cannot expand an area if you don't have an idea how it operates. People will go in there and still be redundant, like you rightly mentioned, because they don't even know what to do. We'll waste a lot of man hours just sitting down, chatting, and all other things. With regards to capacity building, I have a big problem with that. You spoke about government actually starting a top-down approach, being able to build a consortium and moving it forward over a period of time. Realistically, I don't think it can work. Because any government comes in, you're thinking about 4 years. The next government comes in and thinks about what's in it for me. You see, and it becomes problematic. We have preconceived notions. People enter the port industry and they think that, the port is where to make money. So even when you want to seal certain holes and also raise revenue and maybe boost efficiency, people will still be thinking about how they can actually siphon money or make money just by virtue of being in the port. And so we actually educate and maybe close certain gaps. It would be very difficult to actually encourage local participation, or let's say a full local participation. Government is supposed to act as an invisible hand to push the port industry. But you get to see government meddling in. You change whoever is the CEO of maybe, let's say, a port authority is because there's a government in power that is pushing that agenda. And if we continue doing that, I'm sorry to say, it's not going to go the way we actually put it on paper.
Yeah, but I think that's, like you're saying, it's a kind of a next. That's why I call it a conundrum, because it's difficult. And like George was saying, with certain people, we try to do some research to see what really does this port contribute to the national? And this is something that's probably even the Bank of Ghana should be doing. What does it contribute to the economy? Many federal banks or national banks do this kind of analysis and know this is how much is coming from this activity. Even the statistical service in every African country should have that kind of data. People say if you can't measure, you can't manage, and probably that's what's happening to us. What if you're able to quantify at least what the port authority is able to make or gain. I know they pay some dividends or stuff to the government, but you need to look at, just oppose this employment thing with how much you can make if you are much more efficient. And there are countries in this world who have, if you go to their offices, I think George was with me in Aarhus. We went to Aarhus Port. What did we see? How many people in that port? It was like a ghost port. One person sitting in one room as the security, looking at everything around the port. But here, you go to the gate of the port. The security people at Tema Port, they are more than the actual people who must do the work. They're like 500 security people. What do you need 5? That's an army. Seriously. What do you need that for? Running shifts. So you have to look at this. If I'm efficient and I make $1 billion, can I use some of that money to pay welfare money or take care of people in a kind of fund, or use it to expand employment in another avenue? Or you need to do those kinds of analysis compared to having thousands of people at the port and you're making 200 million or even 50 million. We need to be able to quantify these things and see what we can do. People would need the employment. The end product is that people will need the jobs to be able to cater for certain things. So if you're making $1 billion and you can use it to do free SHS or free healthcare, it kind of covers the same thing. It ends up at the same place. You are taking care of their needs. At the same time, you're making your port competitive. Because the alternative is that you put too many people there, you're inefficient. The other competing ports around you would win, and then your ports, they have ports that have actually collapsed, or really like the Port of London. It used to be one of the named ports when you talk about ports. Now, nobody even mentions London when you talk about ports because they made some serious wrong decisions, privatization and other things. So you only become a captive port, and that would just be for your country. You'll be a small fry in the whole game. And that would even be worse than not making it efficient and using the money to help people in other areas. So that analysis needs to be done. Institutions must be looking at that, be able to quantify what's happening at the port. Now, for now, the stage is a lot more political. I only read in the news last week, Nigeria, they sacked their port authority, some of the managers, the CEO and some other managers. And it's happening in a lot of ports in the continent because politicians are interested in the port. There's money there. Yet, what must be put in there to make it worthwhile is not coming forth. And that analysis needs to be seriously done. People must be interested in doing that research. There's part of research that people are not looking at. And you mentioned that the human side, the socio-economic side, we don't really talk about it. We know about the corruption of customs and all these kinds of things, but there are things that are causing it, which we are not really looking deep into. Some people have done some of these researches, but they're hiding somewhere. Nobody even talks about it. So we need, this platform is really good. That's an avenue that we can bring out some of these issues so that people become knowledgeable about it. Capacity is really important in all of this.
I just wanted to add with what Jeffrey was saying about politicians and corruption and 4 years as the term in office for a politician being a bit limiting to the port, having a much more wider vision and all. I think people also have to understand the ports have been operating in this country for more than 70 years. Takoradi Port is an old port.
Yeah.
So when it comes to when it comes to capacity and the knowledge of how ports operate, we may not have the high level technological knowledge or skills, but on the basic level, I think as a country we know how to operate a port, even if we didn't have any foreign participation. This is not to say we do not need foreign participation, but it's just to say that we do have capacity. That's the first thing. And secondly, we have to think about the port as an institution or as a system beyond politicians and beyond terms of office. We need to build a sustainable system that goes beyond personalities, that goes beyond a politician's promises, that goes beyond the manifesto. And a port policy can do that. So, as a country, we need to decide that this is the kind of system that we want and that we put in place, such that whichever politician is in power has to toe in line with what has been developed. I know that in practice, it's more difficult in this country because, for politicians, when they come with their manifestos, that now becomes the thing that we judge them on. But we need to change that conversation and change that space such that we look at the policies that have been put down rather and not the promises. If you come in, and I'm sorry we're delving a bit into politics a bit more, but if you come in with a promise, that has to do with the maritime sector, and say that I'm going to build 5 new ports in the country, those of us within the maritime space should be able to speak up and say that, but our port policy says this, and this is the direction that the country needs to take when it comes to our maritime space. And therefore, if you come with this new idea, what happens to the policy? What happens to the funds that have been put aside to do A, B, C? What happens to the capacity of developing in a certain direction? For example, our port in Keta, I don't know whether that was part of our port policy. This is something that was very new to me. I just heard about this maybe 2 years ago. Very, very new to me. I don't want to speak about something that I don't truly have all the facts about. But I could tell where the port was moving, in which direction it was moving a couple of years ago. Keta Port sort of looked like a curveball that came in. Maybe it's something that the government has seen that we need. But then if we had a port policy, everybody knows which direction we are going to. Everybody's working towards something. And I'm sorry, people need that. People need direction.
Yeah, of course.
People need direction. If you want to develop a system that works, we all need to know where we are heading to. And this is what our sector needs. We need some direction.
Yeah. And I think, that's the reason why I talked about research and development. I mean, in our own training, we knew that the Maritime Authority had a role to play in looking into the future and assessing the needs of the industry. Do we need a new port here? Do we need a new port there? When the trade increases and when there are opportunities and all that. I don't think that is something many ports have. That Keta issue, it was opportunistic because it was a private person developing it, and the port authority comes in and says, "My friend, stop. I'm the only one authorized by law to set up a port." And then somehow they came to an agreement to jointly develop it. So, and I was worried about it also initially, because if private people see the need, what has the port authority been sitting down doing all this while? With I'm not sure they have a research and development unit looking at the trades. And indeed, in our research that we have been doing and talking to port managers, they have actually told us that they need capacity in that space, forecasting and those kinds of things. It's not something that a lot of the people who work as technocrats in the ports do have. And it's sad that we always have to bring the political aspect in, because as much as people need jobs and whoever is put there, either by a politician or through good means, also needs a job or is qualified. Sometimes we don't put the right people at the right place, and that is what makes us inefficient. So they actually told us that they need capacity in certain areas, concession agreements, in forecasting and these kinds of things. It frustrates the very knowledgeable people you talk about. Like you're saying, we have people who are knowledgeable, who can do the job, but usually they are limited by the people who don't know and who are not trained. So, for instance, I have a friend who was a pilot at a point. He left. He was only employed less than a year ago, but he's left again because he doesn't see that the port prioritize pilots. They like security men than the pilots who bring the ship in. So if the pilots, and we and with our interviews with a lot of the marine operations guys, they'll tell you when we request for a walkie-talkie or whatever, they rather buy for the security guys and leave us. So you ask yourself, who is actually doing the job? Is it the security guy or the marine operations guy who brings the ship into the and bringing in millions of dollars? Because that's where the real money is. Okay, so priorities are wrong, and in our own training, I remember when we entered the maritime university first, we were trained in a lot of things that now people consider unnecessary, and they're taking it out of the syllabus because the framers of the syllabus when we entered school to do maritime studies had an experience with Ghana's national shipping line, Black Star Line, where they thought that the managers sitting in the office were out of touch with those who were at sea. They didn't understand the job at sea. So when the captain sends requests for certain spare parts or things that he needs, somebody sits in the office and cancels them out and just provides what they think they can provide. And they fend for themselves on land because they don't understand what's happening at sea. So the idea of training us in certain so-called unnecessary subjects was for us to understand as administrators or managers what the people at sea go through and what they need, so that when they make requests, you don't sit in your big chair in the office and just cancel it. Because you need to understand what they do. And probably that's what's happening at the ports also. So they're more concerned about the minor issues than the major issues. In some countries, pilotage and others have been privatized. So if you don't want it, very soon you see people pushing for it. The same the professionals who are employed as pilots, they are former seafarers usually. And like they say, sea never dries. If they can't stay at the port, they'll leave. And then you have to train people who are not professionals, who accept anything you give them. And they would bring a ship in and hit it against the quay wall, and you have to pay millions of dollars as compensation to ship owners. And so there's a big risk there if you don't develop the capacity and treat people the right way and put the right people at the right places. So that disconnect must be joined. Understanding of every sector of the job as managers of the port, so that you can actually build a port that is forward-looking. Otherwise, that political angle that always comes in would be and that's why people prefer the private ones. If you talk to people at MPS, even if MPS would do something against the states, they'll still defend the company because they see the right things being done. You understand it?
Just on something Dr. George mentioned. When you were speaking, you spoke about the fact that the ports have been operating for years, and also went on to mention the fact that we know how to operate the ports, and at least we have the basic technology to operate the ports. You also spoke about the fact that any port policy we create should go beyond manifestos and personalities. I do agree with that, and I want to actually add what Jonas has said with regards to us being forward thinking. Now, the whole conversation has got to do with integrating African ports into global shipping networks. We might have been operating for long, but if we still maintain the old attitude, limit ourselves to the basic technology, would always be behind. We are in a community that is operating with other countries, bigger ships, bigger vessels, and you realize that we do not force certain conversations. There are certain things that are happening within the industry that we are not speaking about, and that is where I also have a problem. when you start hearing things about blockchain, AI, I know sometimes I'm always talking about technology, but you see that that is something that bothers me, because we are always reactive, and it's a problem to me because we wait for certain things to happen before we try to move. And when you do that, it's actually very expensive. It's actually very expensive. We speak about port security and other things which are necessary. But if you don't also incorporate technology within it, it becomes very expensive. You would make a port policy, all right, but any port policy we make would have to be relevant to be able to stand the test of time. Because if you are going to make policies, all right, that are just going to go and talking about education, capacity building, and other things, and not for certain conversations for it to be relevant in the next 20 years, then we might have failed as policy framers or whatever.
Right. If you don't take care, you go. But I think that there are several issues in there that in the coming months we would have people to share with us their research into, especially the human aspect. That's very difficult. I mean, that's why the C side, the technology, the technical efficiency is being achieved easily. But when it comes to something that involves humans, that's where the real problem lies. And I believe that we would get people to there's a lot of people who have done research in that area around the ports, and we try to get them to talk to the issues. So so if you are listening to us, we thank you for joining us, or if you would listen to this later, if you get this recording, we would be inviting more people to expose us to their research and their findings, and then we can expand the conversation in a way that is practical and understanding to you, but also to educate as well, because capacity building is really important and we all learn from each other. So thank you for joining us on this episode. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.